Welcome to the Bleep Midlife Bulimia podcast with guest Marcella Raimondo. Hi everyone, I am Lorianne. I'm the host of Bleep Midlife Bulimia. And today I have Marcella Raimondo with me, and I'm really excited. She is today speaking from her heart on social justice and eating disorders, and she has been since 1995. We're going to speak a little bit more to that. Thank you so much for being here today, Marcella.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Excellent. So I was speaking earlier, and you are my first guest who has done, clinical uh, checks on bulimia and eating disorders. And so this is going to be really interesting to get some information from you. So how did this all start for you?
Mm. It started for me with my own personal experience of anorexia in my teens. And it was, it impacted my life. It was, I think, as I'm sure you've and many others had experienced, just how devastating having an eating disorder is, and how you fight for it and you hang on for dear life, and at the same time you're just so miserable having it. And so it wasn't until I began to read stories of women of color with eating disorders that I began to understand, like, oh, wow, this is their stories and their testimonials are resonating so much with my own, and to see those stories, I actually felt like seen and validated, and really heard, like, oh wow, the story that I tell myself about my eating disorder, it's not just in my head. There's I'm not just so defective and way out there, and thinking, like, God, no one could possibly understand. And when I began to read stories, I'm like, oh wow, this this is real, and people could understand, and people do understand, and people are understanding, because they're saying my story. And that was incredibly liberating, and just felt like, wow. And it gave me, courage to recover, and to continue to commit to my recovering as a person who had an eating disorder, and yet as a person who experiences life, and we live in a really toxic diet culture that really makes recovery very hard, if not at times just too difficult for folks. And I will say, in my work as a psychologist, when people are telling me, like, it's really hard to recover, or it's so hard to step into a society that doesn't support my recovering, and having to say, like, okay, let's come back to your values. What's important to you? And they're like, I want a life where I'm connected to myself. I want a life being freely connected to others. I want a life where I get to I get to enjoy food and enjoy food with others. And I'm like, okay, so let's hold on to those values, because that's what's important to you. Because yes, you will step into a society that if your body changes, there will be judgment. Not going to deny that. But if we can remember what's so important to you, and the day to day, to have that liberation, then I am going to say recovery is worth it.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
speaking to that judgment, though, that even goes with the eating disorder, anorexia in particular, because it is, something that people do recognize because it shows in your body. But even with bulimia, when they find out about it, there's that stigma. And that's a hard thing to get rid of, even after you recover. It's funny enough, I
Hmm.
spoke to my parents about it and said, I still watch people while they're watching me eat at the table, waiting for me to go and leave the table 20 minutes later.
Right.
It's like, get rid of that. Uh, you have
Right.
done a lot. Like, you are on the advisory board for the Association of Size, Health, and Diversity, which sounds really interesting, and also on the Eating Disorder Recovery Support as past president, and co-chair of the Academy of Eating Disorders Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. So you really are passionate about this. And how do all those work together? Are they out there to help to spread the word in regards to eating disorders? If you can tell us a little bit more of that.
Yeah. I do this work because one, I feel like there's a way that eating disorders like occur in isolation, and also there's also a way that that folks look at this field as something very small, and and I get a lot of praise and congratulations, like, Marcella, it's so great, you're helping these people, and I want to, and and while I think that's very well meaning and well intentional, I also think, like, that's not really what we're trying to do here. And first of all, like these people, like there's such a small segment of the population, and people with eating disorders, oh, they're just such control freaks, and they're so fragile, and it's like, no, that's really not it at all. Like, we're missing the entire boat when if we continue to think that way. And if we continue to think that way, we put eating disorders in this tiny little place in our world of healing. And I'm like, we need to expand that, because there's also this notion that people don't really recover from an eating disorder. I'm like, that's not true. And that's very limiting, very, very limiting to someone who has it. And people can recover. And if we continue to hold that recovery and expand the field and saying, let's really take a look at who has an eating disorder, we would be surprised to see, like, wow, there's a lot more people we think have it. And if we continue to expand and say, let's hear your stories, and let's hear what works for you, we'd be able to expand treatment. And when we do that, then we make recovery quite possible. So I think the more we expand, the more we say, like, oh, eating issues and eating problems and relationships with one body, that's very pervasive, in fact. And wow, we can tap into people's viewpoints and how people use treatment, and what treatment is, and we can expand treatment, and by bringing in more and more perspectives, and more diverse perspectives. And so, like, the field is very white, and that's very limiting, and even limiting to white people too. In fact, it's like, if we bring in more perspectives, like, I really think we would make recovery far more possible than what it is, and kind of even expand how we hold recovery. Still that mindset, like, people really just don't recover. You have an eating disorder for the rest of your life. It's like, oh wow, that really is continuing to put somebody in a very small box.
I
Yeah.
agree with that. And we were speaking to the ones that have spoken to me who have been recovered, and some of them up to 10 years, and then they relapse. And I'm not speaking for everyone, but I do believe that if you believe that it is something that you are not going to recover from, but it's going to be with you, then it's always there in your mindset and your subconscious. If you see yourself as I'm no longer, I think that is helpful. And I love that diversity, because every individual is so different in their recovery. There's no set here, I'm going to put you through this therapy and this will work, because what works for one person won't for another. So
Right.
and the other thing too that you also mentioned about diversity in regards to cultures as well, I think you're very right about it. We don't realize that this is not just something that happens in North America.
Right.
So beyond that too, I really was interested in that you were saying that you're a second degree black belt, and that part of the martial arts was also helpful in your recovery.
Mm-hmm.
So did you want to speak a bit to that?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first, I also want to say that, I was kind of past the medical risk before I started training in martial arts. And so I do want to point out, like, because martial arts, is a physically active art, wanting to point out, like, I didn't jump into it while I was still in the throes of my anorexia. This was like years after. And yet what I will say was that, um, like during my eating disorder, I and my body were very disconnected. And me and martial arts had a way of bringing that connection back again, and seeing what it was like for me to use my body, to step into my body, to move with my body, and to um, I remember just even like the first time I hit a pad, and how terrifying that was for me to be connected to my body that way. I almost cried. It was shocking to me that that kind of disconnect, and how horrible it felt. I mean, I remember like choke. I mean, I'm getting emotional right now. I mean, I remember like choking my tears, like, because it was an experience I did not understand. Like, this is my body. This is what my body does. Yeah, so that part was incredibly powerful. And so I do think there's a way to use that martial arts to come back to what is your body? What is your relationship to your body? There was also a way martial arts helped me use my voice. There's a lot of and we do a lot of role plays and boundary setting, as well as like when you are sparring, what do you do in sparring? And I remember one time working with a therapist and telling her about my sparring, and she was like, that's you in relationships. And I was like, oh God, and that kind of that how sparring symbolized like how I navigated relationships. And so there's a lot of symbolic teaching in martial arts that I think that I found really resonated with continuing to move in your eating disorder recovery. Yeah.
That's very interesting. Oh my goodness. I do believe that that is something though that people with eating disorders do have difficulties with, is, and not all of them, but I know myself I did, was relationships. And, um, I even, it was like you say, sometimes you start to blame something that's not really blaming because you've taken on yourself. But I used to sometimes
Right.
blame my relationship with bulimia for causing grief with my relationship with others, period, not just, in
Right.
a relationship male to female, but even with my parents or, with friends.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I will say, I do want to put in one last plug in for martial arts, is that it does need to be in a safe environment. I'm incredibly fortunate that I train in a place that is very social justice focused, very committed to inclusivity. And so there is no weight stigma. I mean, that there's an acceptance of bodies. There is so to have that type of inclusivity value and principle at where I train makes the recovery process possible, because there are other martial arts centers that do focus on weight, and that's not going to help. Yeah.
No,
So
not
it
at
is
all.
important to really check out, like, is this place inclusive? Yeah. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense, and you're absolutely right. You don't want to be focusing on any of that. You need to be focusing on your relationship, like you said, with your body and your mind and body. I sometimes laugh
Hmm.
sometimes because I had a sore arm, and then I kept telling my right arm, thank you very much for helping my left arm. And people might think I'm totally crazy about that, but you forget about, how one side of your body helps the other one. And,
Hmm.
when you're with an eating disorder, you completely lose track of the fact of what your body, how important it is for you to take care of it
Right.
and
Yeah.
what it does for you. Uh, so in regards to this, so you've got your doctorate in clinical psychology. So do you now work with people with
Yes.
eating disorders. So tell us, do you have any, I don't know, we have listeners here. Do you have any advice or do you have anything you could share with them in regards to that?
Mm,
I'm sure you have some enlightening.
right. I will say, when I work with folks, do want to say, one is like, there, the field is working to make the field more inclusive, and recognizing that we took a very cookie cutter approach in addressing eating disorders, and that the field is being challenged to be more expansive. So I do want to start with that. Um, I also want to let folks know that, that, you know, with recovery, there's going to be like a two-part process, and like a one-part process is going to be to honor and explore your eating disorder. There's a reason why you had it in your life, and there's a reason why you have it, and it serves a function and a purpose, and there's a story behind it. And so recovery is about honoring that. And also recovering is about, okay, what are the steps we need to do to have you rely less on your eating disorder, and to bring in, and to bring in other ways to cope and other ways to deal with life. And so there is going to be some direct behavioral challenges in terms of reducing the eating disorder behaviors, and there's going to be, you know, work to chip away at those, and you know, and want to tell folks like, sometimes it is a matter of taking a deep breath and just keep going forward with that. You know, at other times you're going to be exploring your eating disorder and kind of holding that. And I kind of, there was, someone wrote this in our bathroom in our clinic, and I thought it was, just perfect when they did a quote from Finding Nemo, and they wrote like Finding Nemo, and they wrote just keep swimming. And I was like, I just
Oh,
thought that was so perfect. I was like, yes, because sometimes during this work, you're like, I don't see what's in front of me. I don't know. I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. This is hard. It feels like I'm just working. And it's like, yeah, there are so many times where people are like, I just keep doing this. And I'm like, yeah, you just keep doing it. So I just love that someone took a ballpoint pen and wrote like, Finding Nemo, Nora, just keep swimming.
I just love that. And it is so true. And, you know, there comes that time where I just believe that you do say enough is enough, but quite often you've had to swim a while before you get to that point of saying,
Right.
that's a beautiful story. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, let me just bring up something. So, like I was saying, we talk a lot here about, you know, 35 plus or, you know, midlife. And I know that there's some of my clients who have said, you know, well, I've relapsed after 10 years of being recovered.
Mm.
Would you have anything to say to them um,
Mm.
at
I
all?
do. I would say that, there's no shame in relapsing. It means, I remember listening to this therapist once, and I was just struck by what he said about relapse. And he's like, you know, he's like, I don't even like, for relapses is almost like, it was almost like an act of courage, and that you 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 recovered and you went out into the world, and and here you are, you know, living your life, and we're all vulnerable human beings. And so you lived your life, you put yourself out there, and realize, oh, there's some vulnerabilities in me that are still there. And life kind of, pointed out those vulnerabilities, and as a result, you didn't have the coping skills yet to deal with that. And so that's where relapse, you know, perhaps, took over. And so I just like that reframe, because at times relapse could be kind of blaming, like, see, you really weren't,
Mhm.
you really weren't interested in recovering, were you? Or, see, you can't really recover from an eating disorder, can you? And so there's so much blame and judgment in that word, almost to the point where I wish we would do a massive reframe or change the word, because it, you know, felt like when he like reframed it that way, it was like, yeah, you wanted to live your life, and so you did, but yet we are all vulnerable human beings, and life does present challenges. It just does. Life is challenging. It just is.
I
So
am
yeah.
so in agreement with you. That relapse word, I don't like it.
Yeah.
And I find that, those are really encouraging words. Thank you very much. But I find that one of the, it's exactly what you're saying. Go, well, then I've relapsed, so therefore I'll never be able to come over it. And that's quite often what happens to somebody who goes back to it. They feel, well, I'm doomed now. How do I get out of it now that I was off of it for, let's say, 10 years, and then I'm back in it? Well, I'm back to that, and it took me 20 years to get to the 10 years of recovery. So they feel discouraged. But what you're saying is not to lose the encouragement of that. This just might even be just a snippet of time that, that vulnerability doesn't have to last, as long as
Mm-hmm.
you're aware of it. So
Mm-hmm.
very well said. Yeah.
Thank you.
So this is great. I'm just so fascinated by everything that you've done, and I love that whole diversity. And I mean, I know that it's going to take time, and we always talk about social media. And of course, when I started my bulimia, it was mostly magazines and television. Now it's everywhere. I know there's been steps taken towards trying to reduce that vision
Mm-hmm.
of this is the perfect body type of thing, but we still have a long way to go. Uh, and ultimately, what is a perfect body? This is what
Right.
I keep saying, is that I can tell you that there are, on both sides, men and women, um, that to them, they would look at that and they say, that isn't for me, the perfect body.
Right.
We stipulate one specific type, and then we try and achieve that, which is really not achievable. That is usually the start, but as you said, it becomes a lot more. I remember with my family, they thought, oh, it's just all about thinness, and
Mm-hmm.
that is just not true. It's more
Right.
than that.
Yeah.
So the hidden away factor that you were talking about at the beginning, um, do you, I wouldn't mind expanding on that. Do you find that in general, and I don't like to generalize too much
Okay.
because there's so many different, but if
Yeah.
you find that there is a certain pattern of uh, people that when they have the eating disorder, it does reflect a hiding away of some form?
Um, when folks have any sort of like they're hiding some aspect of themselves away, is that what?
Yeah, and I find that, I know with me, I was also even to the point where I was distancing people.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, I will say that, I, again, making kind of a generalization that, eating disorders, they are about food and body, and they are also about fear and shame and isolation. And so when we start to bring in those words, then we're like, okay, so I'm hoping that when we saying those words, it prompts us to be more curious, because yeah, fear, shame, and isolation, like that's what we see, this kind of shutting down. And when we can have and when we can look at eating disorders like that, then we can say like, oh, so the eating disorders is a protection. Okay, so tell me, like, what why, what is the eating disorder protecting you from? And so like there are so many folks in this field that use all kinds of stories and metaphors to describe an eating disorder, to just really help people expand and help the person themselves who has an eating disorder, like, realize that they didn't make this choice to have it. If they chose to go down this path, it was the choice that actually fit for the circumstance that they were in. So when we talk about, like, the fear, the isolation, the shame, and I know I'm kind of repeating myself, I'm hoping that, it will expand how we think about eating disorders, that they're not control issues, they're not a person's choice, they're not vanity issues, but that it was a survival. Like let's really be yeah, let's bring in, like, eating disorders were a protection and a survival for a person. So when we know that, then we can say, like, oh, that is why the person is hanging on for dear life for their eating disorder, because they don't know how to survive without it. And um, and many times folks with eating disorders are coming into their eating disorder because of their life is in absolute chaos, and they're holding so much. And actually folks even use, like, people with eating disorders are just so rigid, and I'm like, no, that's actually the opposite. People with eating disorders are quite flexible, and in fact too flexible. In fact, they could be more rigid. Actually, I would love there's often so much boundary setting that I'm doing in therapy session. I'm like, yeah, I'd like you to put some boundaries in your life. Let's talk about it. What would that look like? And so, yeah, it's like, no, this rigidity, please stop saying that, because that is just not true. So
I love that, and it's so true. And I
yeah.
know that when some people, because I moved around a lot, when I go to a new school, they quite often thought that I was a snob, and I'm anything but. And it was like really shy, and that moving around was not helpful. But like you said, I had something else that came with me, unfortunately,
Right.
that protected me. But yeah, that rigidness and but no, if anything, I mean, I was very much a people pleaser. I didn't know how to say no, and all of that. And I personally found very much so that I figured out my trigger was when I took on too much, and I tried to prove everything to everyone else. And although I was also trying to prove it to myself, what people on the other side of the fence looking in at me, that was more important than me in my
Right.
home and seeing who I was. So
Right.
and I think that particularly when you're hitting your 30s and your 40s, with the children and everything else on top, piled on top of
Right.
everything else, becomes a little bit overwhelming. But this
Yeah.
is just absolutely wonderful. I really, really thank you so much for your time, Marcella. You are
Oh,
just
thank you.
wonderful. And if I can just ask you to share with our listeners where they can contact you.
They can go to my website, and that is www.marcellaedtraining.com. And so all my contact information is there. And I have numerous resources for eating disorders as well on there.
Very good to know. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.
You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Be sure to visit me at bleepbulimia.com.